We are starting now the 6th plenary session entitled the COVID-19 Innovation System. First of all, I would like to thank, in the name of Brazilian Association of Industrial Economics and Innovation, ABIN, Professor Ken and Professor Campolina. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure have you here sharing with us your knowledge. I am Janaina Ruffoni. I'm very honored to mediate this session. I thank you, Professor Eduardo Albuquerque and Professor Marcia Rapini, for organizing the discussion at this Congress, the fifth ENEI, how we speak. I would like now to present Professor Ken and Professor Campolina. So Ken Shadlen is Professor of Development Studies in the Department of International Development of the London School of Economics and Political Science. Professor Ken studies intellectual property, pharmaceutical industry, and Latin America situation, and recently wrote the article entitled The COVID-19 Innovation System, published in March this year. Professor Campolina is a professor emeritus of the Economics School of Federal University of Minas Gerais, Brazil. He is a researcher in Center for Development and Regional Planning, Cedeplar, former Minister of Science, Technology and Innovation of Brazil. We will discuss here the situation of the innovation through this pandemic situation. It's without a highly relevant subject for us that are researching industry and innovation, and for us too that have living the pandemic situation since last year. So I will pass soon for Professor Ken Shadlen, and we will start with Professor Ken, and then we will have the comments of Professor Campolina. So thank you again for being here with us, and Professor Ken, please, I will give you the floor now. Thank you very much again.
Great. Thank you very much, Janaina, and thank you, Professor Campolina, for being on the panel and discussing with me. Everybody can see my screen. I seem to have lost. Oh yeah, here we are. Okay.
Yes, we can.
And to Marcia and Eduardo and Leo, who invited me and organized this, I'm very grateful as well. As Janaina said, I do research in Latin America, and I've done a lot of research in Brazil, and it's always an honor and a pleasure to be able to present my work in Brazil. So what I'm going to talk about today, as Janaina said, and as you know from the program, is this paper called the COVID-19 Innovation System, which is done jointly with my colleague Bhavit Sampat at Columbia University. And I'm going to try to not just present the paper, which seems like it might be a bit boring since you could just read the paper, but also try to update it and present some additional insights as well. I want to sort of cover these 5 points, and these are sort of the 5 sections. I want to start by introducing the sort of the central concepts that we use in the paper, which I think are probably familiar to most people who work in the field of innovation, about push and pull, and explain sort of how we think it looks in normal times. And then in the second and the third section of the paper, I'm going to talk about how push and how pull look like in the COVID-19 period. And then I want to talk a little bit about diffusion and allocation and access, which is something that is sort of the forgotten part of innovation, both in normal times and in some ways in the COVID period. And then I want to have some comments about what I see as the big challenges that are facing us now in 2021 for the rest of, to get out of this pandemic, which are about the scaling up of vaccine production on a global scale. There's a lot there. I'll do my best to do it in 30 or 40 minutes. If I'm going over time, Janaina, just send me a message and tell me, and I'll also try to hurry myself up. So let me begin with the core sort of, call this sort of the benchmark of the normal times. Like I said a moment ago, I think that most people are familiar with these standard concepts of push and pull, but what we mean by that is a push mechanism for generating intervention, generating, I see there's a bunch of things showing up in the, for generating innovations is essentially funding that comes up front. So I want you to do something, and so I give you money. And so the principle in the biomedical world, the leading push funder has for the last 40 years or so been the National Institutes of Health in the US. Another example of that is the Medical Research Council in the UK. And of course, you know, Brazil is full of the FOPs, and the FOPs basically, FAPESP, FAPERJ, and so on. This is push funding. Pull doesn't give the money up front. Pull basically rewards success with money. So you don't get the money in advance, you get the money if you succeed. And principally, when we talk about pull mechanisms, we're talking about two things. One is we're talking about patents, right? The patent is the classic pull mechanism in pharmaceuticals and biomedical innovation. If I come up with something good, I know that for a certain period of time, I'm the only one who can sell it and I can make a lot of money. So that's my prize, that's the reward. And what we know about patents is that patents seem like they work fairly well at a global level for generating innovations in the pharmaceutical industry where there's a market. We know that patents don't work as well for generating innovations for drugs where there's less of a market. And we also know that patents can create high conflicts between innovation and access precisely because the way the pull works is it allows me to charge high prices. Another form of pull are prizes or advanced market commitments in which essentially I don't necessarily get a patent or the right to charge a high price, but if I come up with innovation, I get a lot, I win something. I get a lot of money. So a prize basically, you know, if I come up with the innovation, then I get $1 zillion. Or if I come up with the innovation, you promise me you're going to buy it. That's where an advanced market commitment is. Those typically are, pull mechanisms that might work more or typically work in areas of neglected diseases where the patents don't work as much. The broad division of labor that I think we see in normal times in the biomedical innovation system. Yeah, and this is a broad simplification, but the normal division of labor is that the public sector gets involved very much upstream. It funds the basic research. And the private sector, largely inspired by patents, focuses downstream on the drug development, the trials, the manufacturing, the distribution. I'm going to come back to this a little bit later in the talk. In some ways, vaccines have always been a partial exception to this, in that there's always been public sector research in vaccines that's been a bit more downstream. But in general, I think this division of labor more or less describes the way the pharmaceutical innovation system has worked. And there's always been less attention to diffusion or to the access. And that's why there are constant conflicts in all countries. In the US, where I grew up, obviously in Brazil, over conflicts over prices, access to medicine, the cost and the supply of essential medicines. I think that the COVID-19 innovation system shows fundamental changes or discontinuities from what I just described. And I'm going to put this in three ways. I'm going to first with push, then with pull. And with push, I'm going to emphasize, sorry, I'm going back and forth. New forms of push, new actors in push, and new priorities of pushing. The new forms is that the push that we've seen in the last year or 15 months goes substantially beyond basic research. There's a heavy focus by the public funders on downstream activities. They're paying for trials, they're paying for manufacturing, they're organizing supply chains, they're reserving capacity in contract manufacturers. In the US, the government has used its instruments to literally to organize a supply chain in the sense that make sure that plastic bags producers and filter producers are producing things for the vaccine effort. Public sector are encouraging partnerships among firms to share information on manufacturing, sometimes allowing things that normally would be considered anti-competitive in normal times. We see this with regard to treatments where there is push going on for new monoclonal antibodies. We see this with regard to efforts to repurpose existing drugs for the sake of as COVID treatments. And here I just listed the US repurposing effort, the WHO's repurposing effort, and what's clearly been the most important repurposing effort, the one that's been done by the UK. In vaccines, we see a lot of what I like to call matchmaking, in which the public actors are trying to unite producers and suppliers. This has been a big part of what the US government has done, again, a big part of what the British government's done, and also an organization that was created just 3 or 4 years ago, the Coalition on Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, is trying to do this. And as I said a moment ago, public research on vaccines has always been a bit more downstream. So in some ways, this accentuates the trend, but this is clearly a lot different. It's also new actors. So I said at the beginning that the biggest push actor in the US and globally has historically been the National Institutes of Health. That's not the case here. The US Operation Warp Speed was led really by an organization called BARDA, which is an agency within the health, essentially the health ministry of the US. And here I just gave some figures. The NIH, the National Institutes of Health, is still spending money on the COVID pharma response, but the other actor, Operation Warp Speed / BARDA, is spending based almost 7 to 8 times as much money. The United Kingdom created a whole new agency called the UK Vaccines Task Force that's doing these things. This is an agency that didn't exist before. They didn't just have the Department of Health do this. They created a new body to do the things that I was talking about on the previous slide. Philanthropies are involved in ways that we are seeing much more of. The Gates Foundation, MasterCard Foundation, Wellcome Trust to Give 3. They're heavily involved in this push activities that I mentioned in the previous slide. In Latin America, the Carlos Slim Foundation is what essentially brought together the collaboration between AstraZeneca, a biologics producer in Argentina, and another biologics producer in Mexico to produce the AstraZeneca vaccine for all of Latin America outside of Brazil. Brazil, as you know, has its own way of acquiring and producing the AstraZeneca vaccine, which I'll come back to later. I don't know if there are any large Brazilian philanthropies that are involved, and hopefully if there are, you can enlighten me on that. And international partnerships, I mentioned a minute ago, this is CEPI. CEPI is funding 12 different vaccine projects that are at various stages. There's also China and Russia are big players on the scene in terms of vaccine innovation. And the question marks there are because I don't know very much about how vaccine innovation is taking place in those two countries. And I fear that many of us don't know. So I see that as questions. And then finally, the third way that push is different in this pandemic is what I'm calling sort of new priorities or sort of a new direction of innovation. And that is that basically the emphasis on vaccines is completely overwhelming the emphasis on treatments. So the National Institutes of Health funding for vaccines has increased by roughly 6 times over its normal allocation towards vaccines. Of the BARDA funding that I said a moment ago is about 15 billion US dollars, nearly 80% of that is going towards vaccines. This is just not the way the biomedical research innovation system has worked in the past. There's nothing like this for treatments. There is no CEPI for treatments. There's no international partnership for treatments. The closest thing is something that's organized by Gates, MasterCard, and the Wellcome Trust called the COVID-19 Therapeutics Accelerator. The Therapeutics Accelerator has given 11 grants up for 98 million, not billion, $98 million. In preparing for this talk, I went back to its website. It hasn't been updated since October. So there's clearly the international effort here is on vaccines, not treatment, in a way that is not the way the innovation system normally works. This is a table from our paper that looks at the BARDA contracts of the 7 vaccines that the US had been supporting. I drew a line here through the one of them that got discontinued. This one, the one with Merck, this project failed in clinical trials. And I also just want to draw your attention that this is old data. It's now, more than 4 months old. But really, for the point that I'm trying to make here, the up-to-date data is not what's important. What you have here for each vaccine is, what I'm really trying to draw your attention to is the stuff in the middle. Some vaccines received, this is Moderna, an initial contract for development and trials and manufacturing. Then a second contract just to help with manufacturing. Then another contract just to help with trials as they went further along in the trials. Then yet another contract for manufacturing. And it wasn't until later that we got the purchasing. I'll come back to that. Some like AstraZeneca is just one mega contract that covers everything. The only one of the vaccine producers that hasn't received any push funding from the US is Pfizer. But of course, Pfizer's partner in Germany, BioNTech, has received push funding from the European Union. This is actually, I just found this last week. It's actually a similar table done by the Congressional Budget Office in the US. It's just a bit more updated, but it's pretty much what they don't do here is they don't disaggregate the types of push funding. So the summary about what's different about push under the COVID-19 era is that it's more downstream, more towards vaccines. But it's also, and I'll come back to these points here, there's the complete lack of coordination. The US does what the US does for the US, and the UK has done what the UK has done for the US, and so on. Production is for national markets. CEPI has been totally subordinated in ways that I will explain later. And the WHO, which should be, you would think, sort of the nerve center of everything, or one I'd imagine, has been completely neglected and sidelined. And not only we don't know much about what's going on with the Russian and the Chinese vaccine innovation programs, but we know whatever is going on has been completely de-linked from the UK and the US big vaccine innovation programs. So let me turn to pull now, how that's different. Well, the first way that pull is different is that it's not clear that patents have actually played any role, which is striking, especially striking hearing that from me, since I've spent so much of my career obsessed with patents. But it's hard to know what's out there because there's a delay in publication, and they're typically, patent applications aren't published for 18 months until after they're filed. So any COVID application hasn't been published yet. So we don't really know what's out there. And it's hard to know what's going to stick because everybody was presumably in early 2020 rushing to file applications at the same time. And they were probably filing overlapping claims and they were probably filing crappy applications. They always do in normal times. So why wouldn't they be doing so in a rushed period of a pandemic? It's also not clear that patents can be asserted and enforced during the pandemic, both because governments may not allow them to, judges may rule unfavorably on it, and there might be a public relations disaster for companies that try to enforce their patents during a global pandemic. And it's not even clear what we mean by, but maybe they can't after the pandemic, but who knows when the pandemic is going to end. It looks like the pandemic can end in the UK before it ends in Brazil, unfortunately for you all, but who knows when the pandemic's going to end. The technological platforms, however, are patented. So there are patent landscapes on the mRNA technologies, and there are platforms on the viral vector technologies, and many subsequent projects, maybe follow-on projects for COVID, but also for non-COVID, might rely on these same patented technologies. So we know, for example, that the two leading firms in mRNA, Moderna and BioNTech, have plans to use these mRNA technologies for cancer treatments. In fact, these firms were founded as mRNA cancer producers. It's just that they hit gold. They hit gold on COVID-19 before they hit gold on cancer. But ultimately, they regard these mRNA technologies as potentially useful for cancer. Treatments might have patents, treatments both for repurposed and for new drugs. But again, we don't know what role patents are playing for repurposing. We don't know which molecules were selected to be in the repurposing trials, whether these choices were a condition of how much patent life they had left or not have left. It's a research question which I'm actually trying to answer. And we do expect there to be patents on the monoclonal antibodies. That would be shocking if there weren't, and many of these were in production, in progress for a bit longer, and I think we even see the patent landscapes on those more. The other principal form of pull that's a lot different is that there's this role of purchases, and like I said at the beginning of this lecture, that typically the non-patent forms of pull, prizes and purchases, have been used to draw innovation into neglected disease areas. But now this is the main sort of workhorse in the pull thing. So we've seen a lot of advanced purchase orders. Obviously the US on that slide that I had before, the UK bought a lot of vaccines, the European Union bought a lot of vaccines, Japan bought a lot of vaccines, and so on. A number of high-income countries bought lots and lots of vaccines, as we know. This meant that developers could invest in trials and production, knowing that they have buyers. The market is out there. That's what the advanced market commitment does. Sometimes this commitment was made on its own, like with the example of Pfizer. Sometimes this commitment was made following the push funding. That's the example that I gave of Moderna before, in which there was push, 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 push. And then finally pull. Sometimes it's all in one, like AstraZeneca, right? Novavax, the push and pull were combined. And so it varies. But this raises a question of what is providing the incentives for the other producers. I mean, there's 100, 200 vaccine producers out there. They're still all toiling away. They don't have advanced contracts, and they haven't received any push funding. We don't know if they have patents. What's incentivizing them? And I think it's that it's essentially an implicit advanced market commitment. They think that if they come up with a vaccine, there's going to be a market for it. They're just not worried about that. However, to do that, they must have some ways of protecting their invention. So they either have patents, or what it probably is are sort of non-patent barriers to imitation. So what's different about pull? In some ways, I think that we have more questions than answers. It's not clear that patents are incentivizing innovation here in the way that I think it's normally clear that for all of the problems that patents bring, patents incentivize innovation in pharmaceuticals. It's not clear that they're doing that in this case. It's not clear if they exist, or if they do exist, that they be enforceable. It might be that non-patent barriers to imitation, the tacit knowledge that developers and manufacturers have, is more important. If so, that's really interesting. Are purchase agreements incentivizing innovation? Maybe. On the previous slide, I suggested that they are. I said that the firms were able to invest in the manufacturing and so on because they knew they would have these guaranteed markets from the US, the European Union, and so on. But it's hard to tell because there's so many other things going on. The push measures already took a lot of the risk out of the investment. They also get reputational gains for participating. They're like global citizens that are participating in putting out the giant fire. And again, they're the non-patent barriers to imitation. It's not clear to me. It's not clear to me at all that purchase orders are actually serving as innovation incentives. It could be that all these purchase orders are doing is perhaps quickening the production of already ongoing projects because there's a milestone. If I get if I get 100 million doses by this date, I get more money than if I get it 2 months later. So it might be speeding the innovation that was already being incentivized by the push. But really, more than anything, I think that what the purchase orders are doing is giving countries priority access to the vaccines. The reason why, the UK and the US got more vaccines faster than other countries is because they were able to buy themselves to the front of the queue. The reason why Israel is way out in front of the whole world on vaccination is because they were able to buy themselves to the front of the queue. And in some ways, I think the purchase order doesn't necessarily serve as the innovation incentive so much as a way to get to the front of the queue. So now let me turn to diffusion and allocation and access. You don't need some American guy who lives in Britain to tell a crowd in Brazil that vaccines are allocated incredibly unequally. So you know that. You're living that. The fact that my 17-year-old nephew in the US has received 2 doses of a vaccine when most people in most of the world haven't even received the first, it speaks it all. We know that. So you don't need me to, there's nothing new there. This is just some data on the paper that shows, looking at just 4 purchasers, the European Union, Japan, the UK, and the US, how much of the projected 2021 production was gobbled up. And a lot of it was gobbled up by just 4 producers, by just 4 companies. And again, this is just through the end of 2020. Last week, Pfizer announced that they were going to produce another, something, they would have another, be able to massively increase the amount of production, and they're going to sell it to the European Union. So the allocation of the vaccines is obvious for us all. We all see it, regardless of which end of that uneven distribution we're on. What happened to COVAX? Where does COVAX fit into this? In our paper, we didn't talk that much about COVAX, but I want to talk about it a little bit here. So COVAX, as I think everybody knows, is a pooled procurement scheme in which this agency, COVAX, purchases the vaccines from the developers, and then the countries procure the vaccines from COVAX. And COVAX has sort of 2 arms. It had the arm which was essentially giving almost free, a slight co-payment to poorer countries. there's 92 countries that are eligible for what's called the COVAX AMC. And they're going to get doses up to 20% of their populations. And then the rest of the countries, which includes Brazil, are self-finance countries that are allowed to purchase the doses from COVAX. They don't get them for free or close to free, and they purchase however many they want. They can purchase up to 50%. In the case of Brazil, my understanding is that the Ministry of Health only purchased about 10% because it was banking on a local production strategy, which we can talk about. The problem is that COVAX doesn't have access to many doses. It's been, I don't know what else is on that slide there. It's been completely overwhelmed by the bilateral agreements that we were just talking about a moment ago. COVAX only has contracts with 5 suppliers. And of these 5 suppliers, only 3 of them have approved any vaccines. That's AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson, and Pfizer. COVAX also has an agreement with Novavax and Sanofi, but it's still waiting. I mean, these vaccines are still waiting. They haven't finished their trials yet. So these are still in phase 3 of the clinical trials. AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson, and Pfizer are the only 3 vaccines that COVAX has received any vaccines from. Just last week, it announced that it's going to get vaccines from Moderna as well. It's going to get 500 million doses from Moderna, of which about 5% of those are going to come in 2021. The rest are all going to come in 2022. If you're like me, you're asking, why did it take so long to get Moderna to contribute doses to COVAX, which we talk about. Even these contracts are often really small relative to their overall production. So Pfizer, for example, as I wrote here, Pfizer is projecting to produce somewhere between 2.5 and 3 billion doses of vaccines in 2021, of which 40 million are going to COVAX. That's less than 2%. Where are the suppliers? Well, clearly, the suppliers want to sell their vaccines to higher priced bidders. Clearly, there's a lack of coordination between the push funding and the supply of COVAX. The way this was supposed to work was that CEPI, the agency I talked about before, was supposed to be pushing, and COVAX was supposed to be pulling. CEPI provides the money to the vaccine developers, and in exchange for receiving the money, the vaccine developers provide vaccines to COVAX. But that didn't happen. It didn't happen because essentially CEPI and the national push funders, not China and Russia, but the national push funders, particularly the US and the UK, they were funding many of the same leading projects. So CEPI was funding AstraZeneca, but so was the UK and so was the US. CEPI was funding Moderna, but so was the US, and so on and so forth. And so CEPI's access conditions saying, we will give you money, but in exchange, you need to supply COVAX, those access conditions essentially get overwhelmed by the access conditions of the big government funders, which is, we will give you money and you give the vaccines to us. And COVAX was outspent by governments. Why is Pfizer selling only 2% of its doses to COVAX when it could sell of all that it's producing? It doesn't take a genius to figure this out, and you don't have to basically be critical of Pfizer for this. It's just the countries are paying more. So COVAX is outspent by governments, and CEPI is outspent by governments. The result of CEPI being outspent by governments is that it can't direct its push funding recipients to COVAX. And the result of COVAX being outspent by governments is that it's at the back of the queue. And it's barely even going to get this 20% number of doses this year. And this, of course, leads to a vicious cycle. I don't think COVAX is going to have a reliable supply, so I'm going to go directly to the vaccine developers and purchase from them. Well, if I go directly to the vaccine developers and purchase from them, and you do, then COVAX is less likely to have a reliable supply. And that only increases the incentives for countries to go directly to the vaccine developers and purchase. And it goes on and on and on and on. That's why I call this sort of a vicious cycle. And here's just one of the best sort of trackers of all of this has been the Duke University Global Health Innovation Center. And I just pulled this down yesterday. This is data from last week. This is just showing where sort of the doses are going, you know, by income level classification. And of course, what this is not showing is the number of people that live here, right? The number of people that live in these four columns is way bigger than the number of people that live in this column. So again, this is the vaccine, this is the inequality that I think we all know about, and like I said, are experiencing from different angles right now. So I see I'm at 30 minutes, and I promised to finish in 40, so I think I'm on time. So let me get to this last section, and then I'll turn it over to Professor Campolina. The big challenge that we face is scaling up production. That's what's going to get us out of this mess. And frankly, that's what's going to get us, even in the UK, out of this mess. I misspoke a minute ago. I said that the pandemic seemed like it was likely to end in the UK before it ends in Brazil. And I think that many of the people in the UK feel that way, but I think that's actually incorrect, because until the vaccine ends in Brazil, and until the vaccine the pandemic ends in Brazil, and until the pandemic ends in Argentina, and until the pandemic ends in sub-Saharan Africa, it's still going on, and we're all still susceptible. So we need a lot more vaccines, massively. And we need them now. We're not talking about millions of more doses, we're talking about billions of more doses. Let me just add that I think the denominator of how many doses we need is bigger than anybody will tell you, because we don't know. Like, we wish we were living in a world in which, say, vaccines are 2 doses, and say we wanted to vaccinate everybody in the world, and some vaccines are going to get lost and spoiled. So we wish we were living in a world in which we only, in quotation marks, we only need 15 or 16 billion doses, or 20 billion doses with losses. But that's not the world we live in, because we don't know whether the immunity that people are getting from the vaccines are going to last very long. They might need boosters. We don't know whether the immunity that people are getting from the vaccines are going to work against variants. Might need boosters. It might mean that we don't need 15 billion doses now. It might mean that we need 15 billion doses annually. We don't know. I'm not saying that's the case, but I'm saying that the denominator of how many doses we need is unknown, but it's probably absolutely staggeringly gigantic. And the problem is that vaccines are very difficult to produce. Biologics in general are much more difficult to replicate, to reverse engineer, than traditional small molecule drugs. Even small molecule drugs are difficult to replicate. Let's remember that in Brazil, when the Ministry of Health issued a compulsory license on efavirenz, an antiretroviral, in 2007, this was issued to import this drug from India, because it wasn't until 2009 or 2010 that the Brazilian laboratories had the capabilities to produce this. And this was an easy drug to produce, because it was only a small molecule chemical-based drug. Biologics are much, much harder. In biologics, ramping up production requires technology transfer in ways that in small molecule drugs is not the case, and the sharing of know-how in ways that is not the case. The key point is that ramping up production requires that the imitators have the assistance of the originators. Some people say what we need is the originators to share their recipes. That's not right. That's not enough. A recipe says, here are the ingredients, here's how you put them together. That's not enough. We need more than just the originators to tell the imitators, here are the inputs and here's how you combine them. We need them to share their expertise about how to combine them, about how to make the recipes. And we need them to share this expertise to get them to do it quickly and at scale. Again, this is not the case with normal drug. It's an entirely different set of challenges. And that puts us in search of licensing and partnerships, of which, by my estimation, licensing and partnerships for vaccine production in Latin America, there are very few. So there's Oxford AstraZeneca, you know, the one in Brazil with Biomanguinhos produced for Brazil. I mentioned the one, this is the one that was funded by Carlos Slim Foundation for the rest of Latin America. This has been held up by delays in Mexico. It hasn't got it. So there are no vaccines yet from this because the Mexican lab has struggled. It's not easy. This is a Mexican lab that's doing it with AstraZeneca's assistance. It's not easy. There's, of course, the other major one in Brazil from Sinovac with the Institute of Butantan. This, as far as I understand, is just for production in Brazil, but I would certainly expect that as production ramps up, if Butantan has the capabilities, that this might be exportable beyond Brazil as well. I'm not sure about that. That's why I have the question marks. Then, of course, there's the Russian Sputnik vaccine, of which these are both very incipient. There's no product. There's the União Química in Brazil, which of course you'll know about, and then a lab in Argentina that is just beginning to produce it. But these are much more incipient. Why so few? The reason why there's so few is that there just aren't that many vaccine and capable biologics producers in the region. Let me just note that these companies are not vaccines producers. These are biologics producers. As far as I understand, União Química is not traditionally a vaccine producer. Tampoco Laboratorios Richmond, it's barely even a biologics producer. And so what the technology transfers have done have essentially convert biologics producers into vaccines producers. Why so few? Then, of course, there's the hope of homegrown vaccines. And I know that everyone's eagerly awaiting the Butantan Vac or whatever it's been called. And then much further along in phase 3 clinical trials is a vaccine from Cuba. And what will be interesting to see is if the Cuban vaccine passes the phase 3 clinical trials is how they produce enough vaccines. Because right now, they don't have the production capacity to produce more than they would need to vaccinate the Cubans. But if they have a successful vaccine, we're going to want that to contribute to our billions. So I think we need globally more licensing and partnerships. We need, I apologize, I'm going a bit over time here. We need more coordinated efforts, matching originators with partners. We need to basically figure out how to convert more biologics producers into vaccine makers, like what I was just saying on the previous slide. We need more of this to encourage, maybe paid for about these partnerships. We need more of the matchmaking. We need essentially an Operation Warp Speed for the world, not just for the US. But I do think that we need to be realistic. We have to ask ourselves seriously, are we at the outer limits? Prior to this year, the world produced about 3.5 billion doses of vaccines for all conditions. COVID-19 vaccine alone by the end of 2021 is about 9 billion doses. How much vaccines can we produce? How many facilities are there out there? I'm suggesting that there's probably more biologics producers that could, with technology transfer and partnership, become vaccine producers, but there aren't that many. How many human resources are out there? I said it requires the active engagement of the originators. At a certain point, they say, hey, all of our people are already with our partners. And then how much inputs and supply are there out there? I'm not saying that we are at the outer limits. I just think that we have to, again, we're gonna have to think more about the distribution issues because there's only so much we're gonna be able to produce. Obviously, the big story of the last week has been that the US government has done a 180-degree U-turn and said it will support this proposal by India and South Africa to waive trips. There's a long way to waive trips obligations as regards COVID vaccines. There's a long, long way to go. This still has to be approved in Geneva. Then even if it were approved at the WTO, national laws would have to be adjusted as well. My sense is that this is likely to have very minimal direct effects. As you could tell from everything that I've been saying, I think production capabilities and not intellectual property is the big barrier to entry. And it's not clear how a TRIPS waiver is going to drive more of the technology transfer and partnerships that are indispensable and that I think we need to be focusing on, as I put on the previous slide. It could be that there are indirect effects. It could be that by saying we will support this waiver, is that this is an indication that the US is actually taking technology transfer and scaling up production and the whole problem outside of the US borders more seriously. In other words, it could probably, if it's going to do these things, it could do these things without the TRIPS waiver, but maybe this is just its way of saying, okay, we now care about more than the 300 and something million Americans. And of course, symbolically, it's important because it's unprecedented. The US, every single time any country has ever proposed any reform to the TRIPS agreement in 25 years, the US answer has always been no. This is the first time not. And so maybe that's interesting. And it's probably why pharmaceutical industry is so opposed, because they also know that IP is not the important barrier to entry here. But if something is unprecedented, then it might be setting a precedent. And they're worried that the US sort of unwavering support for TRIPS in all its form might be diminished. And so they're very worried about this. So my last slide is that I think that the COVID-19 innovation system is not business as usual. Different actors doing different things with different priorities. It's still relying on private firms. So for some people, it's business as usual because Pfizer's making a lot of money. Pfizer always makes a lot of money. They're still making a lot of money. Therefore, it's business as usual. Okay, I don't think that actually gets us anywhere. Everything is different, except for the fact that we're still relying heavily on private firms. But it also features some of the same problems. Push and pull is focused on innovation and output. It's not focused very much on diffusion and access. So there's very little conditions attached to the money that says you have to make the vaccines available globally. And to the extent that push and pull have focused on diffusion, as I've said, it's only been about national diffusion. It hasn't been about global diffusion. So drugs are crazily expensive in the US, but vaccines are free in the US. Why? Because the US effort, to the extent that it's cared about diffusion, has been a US diffusion, but it certainly hasn't cared about diffusion among countries. So I think the global inequalities are both reflected and reinforced by the COVID-19 response. And this speaks to some long-standing, deep challenges of collective action and coordination. So I said I was going to go 40 minutes. It looks like I went 46 minutes. I apologize. I owe everybody 6 minutes of their lives back. Thank you very much for your patience. Thank you again, Eduardo, Marcia, and Leo, for inviting me and organizing. And over to you, Professor Campolina, and I'm honored to have you as a discussant and really look forward to hearing what you have to say. Obrigado.
Thank you very much, Professor Ken. It was very, very interesting. I will pass to Professor Campolina. Okay, Professor Campolina, João Paulo will share the slides with us. Okay. João, please.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Professor Ken, for your nice presentation. I have learned about your studies in your papers. I'm not a specialist in health innovation system, so thank you very much, and thank the organizer for inviting me. It's a pleasure. And could pass the next slide, please. I just organized myself. I'm trying to put only 3 pieces of slide as a guide for my comments. First of all, I totally agree with you that in the health innovation system as a whole, the COVID innovation system has its own particularity. If you take the equipment for health, mechanical, electronic, and prostheses, orthosis, and inputs, it's a different market. It's oriented for the hospitals and other buyers. If you take the human resource infrastructure for treatment, it's not tradable. It's for local. But when you take the pharmaceutical industry, this has a world market. In the case of drugs themselves, is more oriented for treatment. So it's only the people that is ill. But for vaccine, supposed to be for everybody all over the world. So it's a particularity. So the pharmaceutical product is a core sector for competition and intellectual property. And in this, the vaccine itself is more profitable because the size of the market. So I totally agree with you. And one surprise for me was the American reaction to COVID-19. While Mr. Trump was being ironic and making fun of the pandemic, the American institutions have reacted very quickly. This Operation Warp Speed, based in Manhattan Project, is exactly the American paradigm of doing research to make war. So this paradigm is a link to the traditional paradigm of technology in the United States. And the role of the National Institute of Health and the role of BARDA. So they put lots of money in the labs. One question that is not clear to me, in your papers, you make a difference between labs and firms. As far as I can understand, the big multinational, they have also labs, and they have manufacturing production, and they have also a big commercial infrastructure. So if you can make me clear later on what the difference that you make between labs and firms. So I totally agree with you that innovation system for the firms is a business system, but also for the countries, it could be a geopolitical strategy also. It's a way of later on, these firms will become stronger in the world market. So it's also is a geopolitical strategy from some countries. In this case, I didn't understand was a part of UK, the other European countries have been very delayed in the reaction to COVID. Part of the people reacted to take vaccine, and the effort by the European government didn't seem very effective like it was in the United States. And I don't know if it's a cultural or a political behavior, the different behavior in China and India. Both countries have the vaccine, but China controlled very quickly. But India, for a cultural or probably for political reason, didn't take attention. They sell vaccines all over the world, but they didn't take care of their own population. So it's a case that you are seeing now. The next, please. The next slide. So in our opinion, how will the IP be managed next time? Because there was not enough time to register all the patents, so they are running in the production, in transfer the knowledge to production. And how will patents be handled? Do you think this a big amount of money that American government has transferred to the labs are donation, they are financing, or are purchase contracts? By the amount of money, I suppose it's not for purchase contract itself. I suppose they will be not donation to the labs. It's not clear to me what kind of transfer the United States made to the labs, and also why do they transfer money to the German lab, to Pfizer? Because if you see in the stock market, the price of the stocks from the labs has raised very much in last months. This is a profit expectation, of course, for private companies. So you explain now the difficulty of to distribute vaccine all over the world. And can the vaccine be a public good? Do you think there is any possibility of transform the vaccine in a public good? Who will pay for that? Which institution should be in charge of this? What should be done to link the pharmaceutical innovation system to a more social interest? Is it an utopia? United Nations, the G8, the G20 have been passive in discussing the situation of the pandemic in the world. I don't know what institution. World Trade Organization could have some role. World Health Organization, of course, is the institution in charge of this, but they don't have enough power and they don't have enough money. Like COVAX, the lack of power and money. As you have said in your paper, the rich peoples with 16% of population has guaranteed 70% of the expectation of production. So in which situation will be the less developed countries? In some region in the world, like Africa, the pandemic didn't spread quickly as in Europe, in Latin America, or other Asian countries. Why is COVID less intensive in Africa countries? Is only because Africa has more than 1 billion inhabitants, and they have big cities, crowded people. And it's not clear to me if only because people don't move all over the world like other regions, or if have other explanation why some kind of genetic or kind of condition why in the big cities in Africa, the pandemic did spread up to now. The next, please. And now I try to discuss a little bit the Brazilian situation. As you know, Brazil has a very good support. Labs like Fiocruz. Fiocruz is 120 years old. They have experience in producing vaccine and other drugs. Butantan has been very successful. Butantan also is 100-year-old. Other parts of Brazil also have other institutions, other labs, like FUNED in Minas Gerais, that produce a kind of vaccines also. Also, you have great research capacity at the universities, Brazilian universities. By the end of the year, Fiocruz and Butantan is expected to produce their own vaccine by the end of this year. There are other vaccines being produced in different Brazilian universities. They don't have enough support to do the tests. The phase 1, 2, and 3 is expensive. Brazil has experience in producing generic. Generic is the patent that is not active anymore. But these firms that produce generics in Brazil, most of them are multinational companies, not big multinational companies, but they are selling in other countries. Lots of this Brazilian pharmaceutical industry that produce generics and now are selling in other countries. I don't know if they are capable of producing new molecules to innovate inside the generic production labs that have currently in Brazil. But also Brazil has a very good public health system. The SUS was created by the Constitution 1988, and SUS has capillarity. You have also a good regulatory institution, Anvisa. Anvisa is very well prepared. They are doing political use of Anvisa nowadays, but Anvisa has a big number of scientists working there. They are prepared to do this. So it is expected Brazil has also a wide national support and universal vaccine in other fields. However, Brazil is in a process of deindustrialization. We are in a big crisis in the Brazilian industry. In addition to this, our big challenge is Bolsonaro's political misgovernment. We are in a big crisis. Nowadays, if you look in the news, we have in the parliament in Brazil a commission trying to analyze the political position of the government, the president of the country, that don't pay attention to the COVID. So to finalize, what is your view about Brazilian situation? Do you think this institution will be successful to solve the problem of supplying enough vaccine and also to help other countries like South America countries, like African countries? So thank you very much. Is a few questions I took from your papers and for your presentation. As I said, I'm not a specialist in health innovation system. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Campolina. And Ken, please, just a minute. I would like just to say to the participants and the public and that we can, after the can, we will make some questions here from the public. You know, you can send via chat some comments or questions. Okay, thank you. Ken, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Campolina, for your comments. It was great to hear you and hear your view on it. And it always feels good when someone sort of reads a paper and presents what they think the key points are, and they are the key points, because it means that like it's resonated. You raise a lot of really interesting questions, and I'm going to try to address a couple of them, not necessarily in the order that you presented them. So let me go to your last question first, which was your third slide about Brazil. So the collaborations, or I like to use the word partnership, between Butantan and Sinovac, and between Biomanguinhos and AstraZeneca, those are fantastic. Those are great. And they're really important. And I want to make the point that those were only, this was implicit in what you were saying, but I think the world and sort of the broader economic development community needs to really embrace this, which is that those collaborations were only possible because of the pre-existing capabilities that were there. You'll recall a slide that I put up towards the end of my presentation, and I had like 4 collaborations, 4 partnerships in all of Latin America. That's really few. And those collaborations, which I think we are rightly celebrating, are only there because of this pre-existing capabilities that Butantan and Biomanguinhos have, and that have been developed and cultivated over decades. However, it's not enough. And I think there are other like biosimilar producers in Brazil that should also be engaged in partnerships. And part of what I call the matchmaking that I think needs to happen, bringing together originators and and non-originator producers, is finding some of these biosimilar producers and getting them to be able to make vaccines in partnership with the originators. Because the other, as I said in the presentation, the other companies that are on that slide that are involved in partnerships were not a year ago vaccine makers. They've been converted into vaccine makers by the partnerships. And so we need to convert Brazilian biosimilar makers into vaccine makers via partnerships. But there's a broader point here, again, which is that this is only possible because, to the extent that this is possible, it's possible only because of the existing capabilities in the public and private pharmaceutical industries that are there. So what we can do, how we can confront the crisis that we're currently facing, is a legacy of development of the pharmaceutical industries over long periods of time. You can't just snap your fingers, turn on a switch, and have the capabilities for partnerships. And I think that's an important point for development and sort of economic development and industrial development people to think about, is that preserving those capabilities. But we need more of those. Another thing that you asked early in your first slide, which is, why has Europe been so delayed? And you did say Europe outside of the United Kingdom. And the reason why is the United Kingdom is different. And this, I think, speaks very much to the paper that I presented, which is that the UK, like the US, didn't just pull, but pushed. The European Union only pulled. They offered very little support to producers on the way. Very little support there was a little bit of money from the European Investment Bank, but it was peanuts. I mean, it was tiny bits of money. They didn't get in. If you go back to early in my lecture, like the things that the downstream measure, the downstream activities that I would say push funders got involved in, that was a UK and a US story. The European Union didn't do that. They just pulled. And as a result, they had less access to the vaccines. I think there's more to it than that, but I think that's largely the story. I think you're absolutely right that there's this crazy paradox that you have a president who is in denial about the entire pandemic, yet on the other hand led this major World War II-like response, which is the Trump. And I think it's really interesting, and I don't really have an answer for it. It's, you know, I like to laugh and say that Trump was always worried about what he used to call the deep state, which is sort of this existing network of institutions that, according to Trump, were out of control, but maybe the deep state got us past, got us this response despite Trump. I think it's a really interesting observation. And hearing you talk about that in Brazil, where of course you have a similar executive that's had a similar dismissive view of it, but it's an interesting comparison. And then the other thing I'll say, and then I'm going to gladly open it up, let people ask questions from the audience, is just on a definitional thing. I apologize if I use the word labs. I don't mean to use the word labs. If I use the word labs, it's because of my doing research in Castellano and Portuñol, and you refer to pharmaceutical industries as a laboratorio, and so I sometimes refer to firms as labs. But in English, nobody refers to a firm as a lab. In English, a lab is what you have at the university. And then you have firms. If I use the word firm, if I use the word lab for firm, it's just because I do research in Latin America, and it's your guys' fault, not mine. No, because you call it laboratorios. But I mean that the firms have the areas where they do research, the areas where they manufacture, and so on. But when we talk about labs, we're usually talking about public sector researchers. So thank you again, and well, Janaina, back to you to run the show.
Yes, thank you, Professor Ken. We have a lot of questions from the audience, and we have several congratulations for both of you for this speech. And I will start with two questions, okay, from the audience. First of all, there is a question from Pedro Viana Durante, and he is asking, is asking this subject. Do you think that the discussion about breaking vaccine patents can really come true? Even with the patents release, would it still be difficult to scale up? How to attack these two problems at the same time? And then, would you like to answer now, or can I make more two questions, Professor Ken?
Why don't we do in groups of two?
Group of two, okay. And there's another question of Valeria Bastos. And Valeria asks here, Professor Shadlen, how do you see the India-South Africa patent waiver proposal working? Will the patent applications fall into the public domain? Don't you think it is an evolution going to this public domain?
Yeah, so these two questions, I'm glad that we're asking them together because they're very closely related to each other. So as I said, so let me try to walk how I see through the big issues here. What I know in Brazil you call breaking the patent what we would call sort of issuing a compulsory license. But so the question is, can the Brazilian government issue a compulsory license on a vaccine patent? Let's remember, first of all, that the vaccines don't have patents yet, because as I was saying a moment ago, the patents haven't been filed, but they haven't been published, but there might be patents on the technology platforms. And the answer is, of course, yes, that Brazil can issue a compulsory license on the vaccine patents. Could do so, and I know that there's a proposal in the Brazilian Congress now to change the patent law to make it even easier to do so. And whether or not this Brazilian, the proposal that's being debated now goes through or not, I mean, that would probably make it easier to issue what I call issue a compulsory license on a patent, what you'll call break the patent. But I think that even without this law, without this reform, it's still capable under the existing law. However, for me, the issue is what that would accomplish. And I actually think it probably would accomplish very little. And that gets to the point that I was trying to make in the presentation, that the principal problem is the complexity of reverse engineering, the difficulty of making the imitation versions of the vaccines without the help of the originator. And the way it works in regular compulsory licenses normally is that the originator doesn't actually do anything. The compulsory license just means that you can do something and I can't stop you. But I don't actually have to transfer any knowledge. If I'm the patent holder and the government of Brazil issues a compulsory license on my patent, I don't have to transfer anything. The point is that the compulsory license means I can't stop you from imitating. And the problem with vaccines is that if you accept, and it's a big if, because you don't have to accept it, but if you accept that your ability to produce depends on my sharing and my partnering with you, then it's not clear to me what this compulsory license is going to accomplish. I know that the legislation says that if there's a compulsory license, I will be required, the patent holder will be required to share. But that strikes me as powerful words that have very little impact, because you have no way of knowing whether I share or not. And you have no way of knowing how much I shared and how enthusiastically I shared. Enforcing forced technology transfer and monitoring enforced technology transfer is really, really, really difficult. And so my bottom line on this is that if you accept that production by non-originators depends on the engagement and partnerships of the originator, that if you accept that, and again, you don't have to accept that, but I feel very strongly that that's the case. If you accept that, then eliminating, waiving, compulsory licensing, breaking, whatever verb you want to use to the patent probably isn't going to accomplish what we're trying to accomplish. And that gets me to the question that Valeria asked about the TRIPS waiver, which I had a full slide on, and I realized I went over it fairly quickly. I do believe that the TRIPS waiver is a monumental event to the extent that the US supports it, because like I said, the US never supports these sorts of things. I happen to think that the TRIPS waiver would be really, really, really important and useful for drugs, for treatments, because there, the mechanism that I was just saying is unlikely to happen could happen. if you got rid of the intellectual property, the non-originators would be able to imitate. They would be able to reverse engineer. They don't need the originator's assistance. Unfortunately, the US position is that they will support a TRIPS waiver only for vaccines. And I happen to think that in the area of vaccines, it's symbolically really interesting, but probably where it's actually the least consequential. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Professor Campolina, do you want to comment something?
No, it's all right.
It's okay? Okay. There's a lot of questions here, Ken. I will read more 2 questions, okay? One is from Valeria Bastos again, and she asked about, let me see here. In November of 2020, I identified some patent applications for SARS-CoV-2 vaccines. She is saying here. How does Professor Shadlen explain such early applications? And if I can, Professor Ken, I will add another question from we have here Professor Julia Paranhos. It's professor of Rio de Janeiro, and she right here in the chat. Ken, thank you for the great presentation. My question is, what can be done to reinforce originators to collaborate with imitators to scale up production? Do you think the US and UK government can do it? Will they do it?
Yeah. Great. So I see some of these things in the chat, and I also see Leah has put a comment in the chat as well about the lack of industrial capacity. And I think that what Leah has said in one sentence is what I was trying to say, answer to the first question about compulsory licensing and TRIPS waiver, that it's industrial capacity relevant to vaccines that I think is makes those traditional mechanisms less useful. So Valeria, I have no idea how you found applications in November of 2020 on SARS-CoV-2. So I couldn't begin to explain that, if I understood the question right, because in November of 2020, hardly anybody knew. I mean, it was hardly, even the term didn't hardly exist. So I am puzzled. So maybe you could send me some of those, send me them by email, and we can look at them together, and I'd be happy to go over them with you because it's super curious. Julia, great to see you, Julia. I've known Julia for years. So you asked what I think is the single most important question that's out there. And can I just say, at the risk of being a little bit provocative and maybe angering some people, I think this is the question that we should be asking. And I wish that we were all talking about what can we do to get originators to collaborate with imitators to scale up production. I wish we were talking more about that and less about the TRIPS waiver, because I don't think the TRIPS waiver is what's going to do it. So I think that the way I see this is, so let me just say, Julia, that I don't know the answer to any of your questions. I certainly don't know the answer to the question of will they do it. I see this as an issue of the originators have a certain amount of capacity in terms of human resources to transfer technology and to work. So my starting point in this is that the scaling up requires partnerships. That Butantan couldn't have done it on their own. They needed the help of Sinovac, not just because they were worried about intellectual property and infringement, but because to do it at scale quickly, you need the originator's help. So I am fairly convinced of that, but I might be wrong. But everything I say is sort of based on that premise. So if that's the case, if scaling up production requires originators to collaborate with the imitators, then you could pay them to do so. You could say to the originators, we don't need 3 billion doses, we need 30 billion doses, and they will go and find every firm that's anywhere on the planet Earth that right now is producing injectable biologics, and they will figure out a way to turn that lab into a vaccine maker. Remember, I said this multiple times. I said it in the presentation, and I said it in response to Professor Campolina's comment. MabScience, which is the laboratory in Argentina that's making vaccines in collaboration with AstraZeneca, they weren't the vaccine maker. Union Química, to the extent I understand, that's about to start making vaccines with the Gamaleya Institute, correct me if I'm wrong, not a vaccine maker. So find the firms that have capabilities. I call them the latent or the potential vaccine makers, and bring them into the network of vaccine producers. But to do that, you might need to pay the originators more. In an ideal world, you would have written the contracts a year ago. You would have written the push and the pull contracts a year ago, requiring them to do that. We can't we can't redo what was done a year ago, but new contracts going forward could be doing that. Just last week, the European Union signed a contract with Pfizer for close to 2 billion doses. If only that contract said, we want 5 billion doses, 2 billion for us, and another 3 billion for the world. We could write the contracts in that way. But I don't think we can just tell them to do it. I don't think we can order them. I don't think we can do it by fiat. I don't think we can compel them. And then we have to work with the originators to get them to do that. I do think that, and I'll turn to the next questions, and after just saying one last thing, I do think that there are some efforts being done to do this. I think what I'm saying is actually what, for example, the new Director General of the World Trade Organization is trying to do, bring everybody together. Maybe we need to do it with more urgency. When I refer to an Operation Warp Speed for the world, that's what I mean. Bringing together originators and imitators to scale up production. But again, everything that I'm saying there, my entire answer to your question, Julia, is premised on the assertion that scaling up that the imitator's ability to scale up requires the active engagement, I'm going to say the willing engagement of the originators. If I thought differently, I would be talking about TRIPS waivers and compulsory licenses, and TRIPS waivers and compulsory licenses, I would think that they are really, really important. And as I was saying in answer, I think, to the question that Valeria asked before, I do think they are potentially important for treatments, but less so for vaccines.
Okay, we have one more question here. This is a question from Professor Orlando Martinelli from the south of Brazil. And Professor Orlando asked follow. What is your view, Professor Ken, on global vaccine chains? Do you think they can help productive efficiency and increase the speed of global vaccine production or not?
So that's a really difficult question for me because I don't know. And the reason why I think that's a difficult question is I don't really have anything to compare it to. There's no counterfactual. We've never had to go from 0 to 15 billion, although as I said in the lecture, we need more than 15 billion, so quickly in the pharmaceutical area. So I can't say whether I think that sort of fragmented global value chains in vaccines are helping or hurting. I just don't know because I don't have anything to compare it against. I know that there's a concern that's out there that if you had too many different producers trying to get a hold of too many of the same sets of inputs at the same time, that you could create blockages. And I think that there is potentially something credible to that argument, but I'm not sure that that argument is right either, because again, this is sort of unfamiliar territory. So I guess I would say that I think that's a really super interesting question, and it's a super interesting question for research. But I certainly don't know the answer, and I would be skeptical that anybody would claim they know the answer because this is such a new and uncharted territory.
Okay, Professor Ken, Valeria put something here about that question, and that she mentioned some patents from November 2020. And she say here, I don't know what is the first thing, but CureVac, Moderna TX, and Cancino, maybe, among other patent applicants, source from patent scope, about that discussion.
Yeah. Again, I don't know those patent applications or patents. Valeria, I'm not saying that I don't believe you. I'm saying I don't know. And so maybe offline, you send me those. We can talk about them and go over them. I find it to be really surprising. But like I said, I'm not saying that you're wrong or I don't believe you. I'm just saying I ni idea.
Okay, I'm sure that Valeria will send you an email or a message to discuss this subject. And I have here, we have another, Professor Eduardo Buquerque, sending right now an observation. Ken, excellent presentation and discussion, congratulations. A question on Biden. What are your thoughts on new geopolitical trends during this government? How far can he go in direction of international initiatives, like your proposal of a global warp speed? It's a very good question.
Yeah, it's a great question, Dula. A great question. And so, I mean, I think that he could do a lot because he could throw money at it in the same way that Trump did. And so he could essentially do similar things that Trump did and do it with a more global orientation. I think that will be easier now that most of the US is vaccinated. so it won't feel like he's looking at the rest of the world and neglecting the US. So, I mean, Trump was America first, as we all know, but I think it might have been difficult even for Biden to not be America first in the height of the pandemic. But I think it might be easier for him now. However, the principal problem is that unless the US will collaborate with China, then I think there's limits to what can be done for this sort of global collaboration. Because China has vaccines. China has, 2 of the vaccines that are being used across the globe, Sinopharm and the one that you know in Brazil, Sinovac, come from China. There's another one, CanSino, which is being used less, but there are vaccines from China, and so sort of have it's hard to talk about a global effort when the 2 largest vaccine producers in the world, the US and China, are operating in totally different spheres. And so Eduardo, what you're asking me is, can Biden sort of turn a geopolitical conflict with China into a area of cooperation with China? And that, I think, is unlikely. So my answer to your question is, I think he could go a long way in sort of doing what Trump did, but doing it at a more global scale. But there's some sort of structural limitations, because I don't think that even the COVID-19 pandemic is going to allow sort of cooperation between the US and China.
Okay, Ken. Well, we don't have here more questions. I think that we answer all the questions. You answer all the questions, and I don't know if Professor Campolina or Professor Ken would like to say something more.
No, I just want to thank you very much indeed, and thank you, Professor Ken. I learned too much about the COVID innovation system.
Yes.
I hope you can find solution for this problem, even to the poor countries. Thank you very much.
Okay, Professor Ken, would you like to say something?
Likewise, I would like to thank you, Janaina, for hosting, and Professor Campolina for your comments, and everybody in the audience for bearing with me, listening. Desculpas por não falar português, portunhol. And I thank you very much for the questions and the provocations. It's, like I said, it's always wonderful to be engaging with colleagues in Brazil. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Ken and Professor Campolina. It was a very nice and a very rich discussion here. We can say, I think, that it's a very complex discussion. It's a very complex situation. And I think that here, Professor Ken, we can figure out that we have a different, I don't know, maybe structure about the innovation system when we are talking COVID-19 innovation system. So I think that your work make us to be in attention about this modification in the environment. I think that you have to pay attention in these movements, and we have a lot of information to deal with here from to the future to understand better what kind of solutions we will have for this scenario. thank you again. For us in Brazil, it's very nice to hear your studies and think about our situation. I think that Professor Campolina helped us to think about the poor countries and in developing countries like Brazil. We have here a very rich innovation system in terms of the health system, like SUS, like a lot of institutions, Butantan, Fiocruz, and another one, but we have a big problem to solve in terms of pandemic. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the audience. Thank you from our support here from João Paulo, from Paulo, and I think that's it.
Obrigado. Bye.
Obrigado. Please, Professor Ken. It's not possible for me to forget that Duda, Professor Eduardo Albuquerque, remember me before that you have already been in a football game here in Brazil, and he told us probably you have a unique situation in your CV, your curriculum, that you are a researcher from London that have been here at Brazil, especially in Minas Gerais, in a football game of, I think that Tupi football club. I don't know if you remember that. And
yeah, I know Tupi. Yes, I know Tupi. Yeah.
You know Tupi. Okay.
Yeah. The other thing Eduardo can tell you about, and we can end here, is my long-standing campaign to change the calendar, but that's a different story. I'm a big Tupi. Yeah. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm sure that in the future we can be together face-to-face, in a face-to-face event, in a face-to-face meeting. And for now, it's possible, and we thank you again. Thank you again, Professor Campolina.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.